Good evening, students. This is actually the second video for this week. So if you're viewing this video first, stop and go back and see the other one and come back. The other video is an overview of the course. This video really focuses on what we're doing the first week. I call this video Introduction to Immigrants, and I call this week a spiritual and human grounding. So what do I mean by that? This week we're primarily listening to stories, reading stories, viewing stories. Because at the core of the phenomena of immigration are the people called migrants. And it makes particular sense as Christians to start with those people. Matthew chapter 12, verses 9 through 13 is one of the examples, the multiple examples of Jesus healing on the Sabbath. And the point that Jesus makes as he does that is that even though the law is important, remember the Sabbath is one of the 10 commandments, it's not unimportant. Even though the law is important, its importance pales in comparison to the primary importance of the life and well-being of every human being. And of course, every human being is someone for whom Jesus died. That's how important each person is. So we start with that human reality, which is a spiritual reality. And we are paying attention to stories from at least 2 sources, and 3 if you would like to view the optional video. So we're reading the full text of The God Who Sees by Karen Gonzalez, and it is her personal story of her family's migration from El Salvador, and she is placing that story in the context of biblical stories. And of course, your essay for this week, your first essay, is trying to do that with your own story, telling your family's immigration story or migration story. Some of us have to get a little more creative than others of us. Some of us have a forced migration story as well. But so we're going to try to look at our own story in relationship to the biblical story, biblical stories. The second text that you're reading is Welcoming the Stranger, which, as you have, I'm sure, observed, is not an academic text. It's really a text for the church. And anytime I give you a text to read that is a text for the church, I want you not only to read the text, but I want you to think about how this text would communicate in the context of the churches that you've experienced. Because part of what most of you, if not all of you, are learning is how to communicate to the church. So that's always an aspect. Remember, I said in the other video that we are looking at the phenomena of migration, and we are looking at the response of the church to migration. And so part of what you're looking at in Welcoming the Stranger is how do 2 people who are at the upper levels of world relief, how do they present the story of immigration, the facts about immigration, as well as the story of migrants to the church as effectively as possible. And there's also a lot of just very good information in the book as well, and easily understood, so that it will help you actually it will be a natural framework for some of the more academic texts that you read. So you have The God Who Sees, and you have Welcoming the Stranger. And the chapter that you're reading from Welcoming the Stranger is full of individual stories, and it also takes a small step back and looks at those stories as examples of more general truths about who migrants are and who migrants are not. The third option that you have is to see the documentary video, The Stranger, which is produced by the Evangelical Immigration Table. I'm going to warn you right now that it's not exactly unbiased, that it is a documentary that is trying to make the case for comprehensive immigration reform. So, you can pay attention to the larger case or not. That's not actually why I'm giving it to you to see. I'm giving you to see because the true stories are very well presented and give you a real understanding of what it's like for immigrants in the face of a broken immigration system. So they're really powerful stories. They're really worth viewing. And there's a bunch of other information in it as well that you can pay attention to or not as you choose. I wanted to give you a little bit of a framework for the information that the Welcoming the Stranger chapters that you're reading this week give you about who migrants are and are not. The 3 lines that you can stand in at this point, the 3 major lines that you can stand in order to immigrate to the United States we call blood, sweat, and tears. And those are actually the lines that you would stand in to immigrate to most countries in the world. There are 3 general drivers of immigration, and there are also the 3 major reasons why countries will accept immigrants. So what do we mean by blood, sweat, and tears? Blood means a blood relationship. It means that the person who is immigrating is a family member. If we're looking at U.S. law, it's a family member of a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident. But if you're talking about that blood category in terms of immigration in other parts of the world, it just means that you are actually related to somebody who has a right to be in that country. The sweat category talks about sponsored employees of U.S. citizens. And of course, if you look at that more generally, it's that you have a work reason to be in the country, that there's an employer in the country who wants you to work for them. Of course, in the U.S., you have to show that there's not an American citizen that wants that job, but that's much more complicated, and we'll get to that later. The third category, the tears category, is the category that usually refers to refugees, or if you are a refugee who is applying to be recognized as a refugee at the border, you're often called an asylum seeker. These are people who are fleeing violent persecution in their country of origin, usually as a result of a specific characteristic. So it's a result of your race, your religion, your political opinion, your membership in a specific group. I always forget the last one. But those are the 3 lines, as I said, that you can stand in to immigrate to most countries in the world. And they're the 3 what we call drivers of immigration. They're why you might want to come to a new country. So the stories that you'll read in Welcoming the Stranger are all connected in one way or another with blood, sweat, or tears. So you can look at those dynamics as you read those stories. The other information that you get in Welcoming the Stranger is you learn about the most common myths about who migrants are. So you learn about who migrants are not, because you learn the ways in which those myths are not true. So it is a U.S.-centric book, so it is talking about how they are not true in the U.S. But what's interesting is that those same myths exist in a number of places around the world, that they are a natural set of assumptions, negative assumptions about migrants, apparently, because we've seen them in many other countries as well. So the first myth is that migrants are a drain on resources. The second myth is that they are criminals. And the third myth is that they are terrorists. And in the US, of course, Muslim terrorists is usually the phrase that is used to talk about and think about the people that are coming to this country. Although sometimes we also talk about them as gangsters. Although I think gangsters probably fits more into criminals. Anyhow, so you'll read the evidence for the majority of immigrants not being a drain on resources, a criminal, or a terrorist. And I think that's an interesting foundation and framework for then diving more deeply into understanding the phenomena of migration and the church's response. So as always, I'll be fascinated by your responses, and I'm interested in all your questions. So thank you.